Good afternoon. It's my pleasure to welcome everyone to this session, and this session is going to be comprised of two parts. The first, and the one we're looking forward to, is the conversation with U.S. Secretary of Education Betsy DeVos, and I want to extend a very special thank you today for being with us. And the second part will entail having three very opinionated and knowledgeable individuals join us. William Bennett, former Secretary of Education, Steve Bullock, Governor of Montana, and Jeb Bush, the former Governor of Florida. I'll begin with a brief introduction of the Secretary. Secretary DeVos is not new to the arena of K-12 education. She has spent 3 decades deeply involved in matters of educational policy. I think it's fair to say, though, that you've taken your long involvement and your commitment to new levels by now being the highest ranking education official in the country. Congratulations.
Thank you, Lowell. Thank you.
Secretary DeVos is the daughter of a public school teacher, a first grade teacher. I'm confident that your mother's expertise as a classroom teacher was very valuable in your early years. Secretary DeVos believes that neither zip code nor income should determine a child's opportunities for a world-class education. For 15 years, she served at-risk children as an in-school mentor in the Grand Rapids, Michigan public schools. And as a leader in the movement to empower parents, Secretary DeVos worked to support educational choice for students in 25 states and the District of Columbia. Madam Secretary, thank you for your service. So let's begin. Tell us about your first 80 days in office.
Well, first of all, Lowell, let me say thank you so much for the opportunity to be here and to participate in this conference. You've clearly brought together an amazing group of leaders, and I'm grateful to have the opportunity. The first 80 days, if that's what it's been, it seems like a whirlwind, have been really, really very great on balance. I have described it on some days as a giant game of whack-a-mole. When you think that nothing new and unexpected is going to pop up, it certainly does. Those moments are becoming fewer as we become more familiar with the department, the individuals, the programs, all of the different departments they're in, and I'm pleased to say that we're doing well with getting the team in place. Still not filled out in terms of all of the assistant secretaries and all of the other confirmed positions, but we are progressing well. So it's been good.
So the federal government for, I guess, a half century has been using its efforts to try to improve educational opportunities for all students. And we know in certain instances the federal government has actually made an impact in areas of special needs, for example, anti-discrimination areas and so on. But we know that with the new Education Act that there is a reset, and the power, while the states have always had the power in education, we know that they are going to be given far greater flexibility in the future to actually set the accountability standards and issues that deal with evaluations with teachers and so on. So as you're out and about in these last 80 days and with your involvement, what are you seeing that gives you confidence that the states are going to be able to step forward and do what's necessary to elevate student achievement for all students?
Well, the Every Student Succeeds Act, or ESSA as some like to refer to it, was passed by Congress at the end of 2016. And it really was intended, the congressional intent with the act was really to return a lot of the power and decision-making to the states surrounding education. So we are now just in the process of receiving proposals from the states. That goes on throughout the balance of this year. And we will be looking closely at the opportunities that the states are taking to approach the new flexibility given them with a higher degree of innovation, we hope, and with intentionality around the articulation of expectations for students and student achievement. It really is a new trajectory in that the federal government for more than the last decade has really taken on more and more of the responsibility, and in many areas overreached its role. And the states have been in much more of a compliance situation. And so we're very much looking forward to the variety of proposals and plans that the states put forward, with expectation that we're going to see some real creativity around what their approach is.
You've made much of your work in education policy to try to elevate the opportunities for those students who you feel are not getting a quality education. So let's spend a moment and let's take a look at sort of the state of American education very quickly. Could we see slide 23 for a moment? So we see that actually some progress has been made in moving proficiency in fourth grade math in our nation since 2000, which is a year or so before No Child Left Behind. Could we see chart 24? And we haven't made as much progress in fourth grade reading. Let's take a look at 97 for a minute. So this shows proficient levels in fourth grade math by race since 1990. I can only say shockingly, in 1990 you could see the low proficiency rates. And certainly we've made some progress. We can see among African Americans and so on, we went from about 1%, it looks like, to almost 20%. But we can still see wide differences in achievement levels by race. And it's hard to believe that in the year 2017, we still are looking at proficiency levels of 20% among Hispanic and Black students. Let's see chart 19 for a moment. And we can see that among fourth grade students that score below basic, which means they are unable to read in fourth grade, that we still have high percentages of students. And the last...
If I could just interject there.
Yes.
I mean, fourth grade is a really important grade level, but if you back up a grade, we expect students to be able to read by third grade, because up until and through third grade, you're learning to read, and beyond that, you're reading to learn. And so this is a very troubling and significant graph.
And then let's just jump to the last slide for a moment, then I'll ask my question. Slide 31, please. So we're looking here at 12th grade. How are our students doing when they are actually leaving the K-12 system? And we can see that in both math and reading, the level of proficiency is not what we'd want it to be. To think that the 12th graders in America, that there's only a little bit less than a quarter reaching a level of proficiency, and that level is needed if you're going to be able to move on successful to the next stage of learning in life. So with this by way of background and so on, we obviously have enormous challenges that face us in our K-12 system. So I ask you, Secretary, how can we think more boldly about systemic change within K-12 education so that we can truly move the needle on some of the numbers that we're seeing?
Well, it's no secret that I've been a longtime advocate for empowering parents to make the right choice for their child's education. And I would hazard a guess that probably all, if not all, the individuals in this room have been able to make those kinds of choices for themselves and or for their children. We need to empower all parents in this country to be able to do that, because right now we are trying to force fit way too many students into schools and into a system that's not working for them. And so it's my belief that on a state level, state by state, policies need to be changed. And in many states, we've seen progression in that direction. Florida, Indiana, Ohio, Wisconsin, Arizona being probably, and Louisiana being chief among those. But we need to be really opening up a system that for too many years has been closed to those on the lower end of the economic ladder. And I think that the resulting change that we will see, while it will take some time to actually realize, will be significant in terms of the achievement of our students.
I understand that one thing we know that in education, it does move very slowly. Let's take a look at slide 104 for a moment, which really shows the current distribution of K-12 students in our country. So we still have about 75% of students that are in district schools. Some of those district schools are doing very well, and some of them are not performing well. So the question is, what can we do for those district schools to try to improve their opportunities to make some progress?
Well, frankly, a lot has been attempted over the last couple of decades to try to change district schools, to try to change traditional public schools from a top-down approach. And we're not a top-down nation. We really are a grassroots, bottom-up, try things and adopt the ones that work and discard the ones that don't. Yet in education, it really has not been an environment that allows for this in any meaningful way. And so, again, I believe that by opening up the system in terms of public policy to allow for a whole range of choices to all ranges of the economic spectrum, that we will begin to see the kinds of change that we really need to see to bring education in America into the 21st century.
So when we talk about changes and we talk about opening up, let's get more specific as to what that would entail. So what are the ideas today that you're looking at that would really open up the system, both from an actual school point of view and also from the availability of content and things of that nature? How do you envision that?
Well, your graph, your chart showed the current distribution of where students are attending. And the reality is that for those attending private schools, most of them are attended by individuals, by families who can afford to pay the tuition. Very small percentage of those are actually accessed by lower income families. Charter schools, as we know, are public schools that have become an important option and an important alternative, and yet there are tens of thousands of families on waiting lists for the charter schools that are currently available. The district schools of choice have proven to be a very important option in a number of states that allow for this. But when we talk about really opening up the system, we talk about offering those kinds of options and opportunities, including magnet schools within a public system. But we also talk about things like course choice and virtual learning. Homeschooling has become a very significant piece of that equation. I don't think we even had that in the graph here, but homeschooling is purported to be growing at a 12 to 15% rate annually, and there are about 2 million students today that are being homeschooled. The point is that the overall ecosystem needs to be a wide range of menu options, including the ones on the graph and ones that I mentioned, and ones that may not have even been thought of yet. There's nobody today that gets involved in education as an entrepreneurial activity other than generally on their own child's or grandchild's behalf. And it's because it has been a closed system. By opening it up, and it has to be done on a policy basis, state by state, by opening it up, we will begin to see the kinds of changes that we need to see in terms of opportunities for all students to be in a learning environment that works for them. And we will begin to see the innovation in education that we haven't seen in the more than 150 years since the Prussians brought us this current model.
So you have visited a number of schools recently, and one of the points you made is that you feel that we created a stigma in our country for career education, for career-ready types of education. So do you see that as a key element in sort of opening up and changing the dynamics of what we have today in our school? Historically, we were reluctant to do that because so often a lot of the ethnic minority groups were channeled in to various kinds of career education and weren't necessarily given the opportunity to move on to a four-year college. But as we see today the mismatch between the jobs that are available and the skill set that we have, it sounds like that this might be a real opportunity. What are you doing today in that area?
No, it is a real opportunity, and I had the opportunity to visit Valencia College in the Orlando area, and then also Miami-Dade College and Florida International University in Miami recently. And the important work that Valencia and Miami-Dade, to a large extent, are doing is locating in the communities that are least likely to consider college as an option, and are introducing the opportunity of college and the possibility of college to high school students through dual enrollment in these schools located in their community. So for students who have nobody in their family that has ever gone to college, they can experience college level work while still in high school in an environment that is familiar to them, and gain the confidence that they can actually pursue a college career. So the dual enrollment option, I think, is a really important piece of the equation. And the relevant training and education options that schools like these are offering, that are partnering with local businesses to actually get them ready for a meaningful, highly skilled, highly technical career, is another really important piece to encouraging young people who may not be bound for a four-year college, but who certainly can take that first step with a first credentialing process, and then layer onto that later with additional credentials as they gain more confidence and more success, and are able to be in the workplace in an immediate way.
So when we're talking about opening up the system, we've spoken about the issue of charter schools, you've spoken about magnet schools, you spoke about course opportunities, where students are able to take courses that perhaps their high school does not make available, but they're also able to take college courses. We see some of the states today that are actually providing stipends. They're providing funding to individuals for course selection. We've spoken about career opportunities and so on. We've spoken about virtual. Is there any other avenues that you're pursuing, or are you of the view that we need to permit other innovative individuals to come up with ideas, and then we need to test those kind of ideas, of course?
Well, one of the approaches that a number of states have adopted recently, albeit in fledgling ways except for Arizona, is called the Education Savings Account. And it really opens the door to fully customizing a student's education. So if my student is really interested in being part of a charter school, the child could take 2 or 3 courses there, could take 2 or 3 courses online, could do another elective course in another institution, really using the savings account very much in a manner that is customized to their needs and to their interests. And I see the Education Savings Account, as really being on the forefront of creating new opportunities for students, but also a lot of opportunity for providers to address, again, the needs of individual students.
So let's shift gears for one moment. Let's talk for a moment about educator quality and so on. So I happen to be an individual who spent many years of my life focused on the issue of teacher effectiveness.
Yes, you have.
And I happen to believe that one of the reasons why we have not been able to achieve meaningful, sustained improvements in student achievement in our country is because we haven't restructured the teaching profession to provide career opportunities and professional growth opportunities and competitive compensation so that talented young people will come into the profession. So the federal government tried to take some initiatives over the past 5, 6, 7 years in that area to try to stimulate some type of innovation. So the federal government is no longer really going to play a role in that area. So it's really up to the states. And one might argue that the states really weren't doing anything in that area before the federal government got involved. So how can we look at the issue of teacher effectiveness, which we know from research is the single most important in-school factor that will determine how a young person will perform. How can we really address that issue?
Well, having just had the opportunity to meet the National Teacher of the Year and the State Teachers of the Year through one of the longtime programs in Washington this past week, I was again reminded of how many great and wonderful and dedicated teachers there are, and how we have not really done an adequate job of celebrating them and honoring them in the way that we need to. And I think that part of that problem is the system is really not set up to celebrate them and recognize them and compensate them accordingly. And that's why I really appreciate the program that you've started, Lowell, to really measure teacher effectiveness and give state, in this case, state lawmakers and state administrators the tools and the opportunity to really challenge the teaching profession in a new way, and hand in hand the system that actually employs the teachers. And I would just love it. I don't know if everybody here is familiar with the four pieces of that, but if you would just talk about those for a second, because I think they're really critical to encouraging really talented young people to consider a teaching profession.
Right. I mean, the initiative creates career paths for teachers, has intensive professional development at the school site, job embedded. It has performance pay, and it has evaluation, which is seen as an extension of professional development. But we have seen that not only gives teachers in the profession the opportunity to really be in a profession and have a career, but as you just said, we have so many talented young people in our country, and when you hear teachers themselves tell their children, don't go into teaching, or you have parents tell their children, don't go into teaching, I think that we have to understand that if we're going to attract these young people to the teaching profession, that we need to offer them a true career. We need to offer them competitive compensation. And you have mentioned before that it's pretty much up to the states to create that environment today. But as you've also said, you have the ability to shine a light. Maybe you could talk a little bit about the bully pulpit the federal government has in that sense, even though you're not going to be necessarily controlling what they do.
Well, I do think it's a real opportunity for the Department of Education to highlight programs such as this and best practices, and to encourage states to adopt high standards around the teaching profession, as well as high standards around academic expectations for their students. And I view that as one of the important roles that I will have going forward, to really highlight the best practices and then also, in some cases, highlight places where they're really shooting way too low.
So Betsy, there was a recent op-ed in the Washington Post by two state school chiefs from Massachusetts and Louisiana. And they wrote that, quote, nonprofits external to the school system have helped guide nearly every real transformation we've seen, because they provide not just guidance and support, but also political insulation and durability. So my comment to you is, do you believe that that has been the case? But more importantly, what role should philanthropy, and let's even say the private sector, play in helping support state efforts today in the area of education reform?
Yes. First of all, I believe it's absolutely been the case that these philanthropic efforts outside of the system have been critical to policy changes in states. And I can say that because I was involved in them. And I think the effort with which I was involved has been very effective. It was a counter to a very political environment that was and is protective of the status quo. And for legislators at the state level to cast votes in favor of giving parents and empowering parents with more choices in education, that's a scary thing for a lot of legislators. And if they have no confidence that if they're challenged on that particular stance, that somebody's going to have their back, they're not likely to support
support it.
what they know in their heart of hearts to be the right thing. And so this is a very, very important effort and initiative, and I encourage any in the audience who are inclined to support work like this to please do so, because it has a very, very significant and meaningful impact.
Let's move to charter schools for a moment. Obviously, charter schools have had significant growth in our country. I think there's about 7,000 charter schools in our country today. I think there's approximately, is it 3 million or so?
I think it's about 3 million students.
Today. So there's been a lot of talk about whether or not charter schools are being held accountable and under what measure they should be held accountable. What is your view as to whether charter schools should they have to attain a higher level of academic achievement than the standards that are applied to traditional public schools? What's your thinking on that?
Well, first of all, I would say the first measure of accountability for charter schools is the fact that they are being chosen by the parents who are sending their children to them. And that is, I think, a very meaningful and important measure of accountability. And then in every case, a charter school is accountable to the authorizer, whichever entity or body that is. There are many layers of accountability required of charter schools. And in fact, authorizers and parents, if they choose not to send a child to a school because it's not doing the job, will ultimately close a charter school down if it's not meeting the needs of the students they're supposed to be serving. Contrast that with a traditional public school, and in very few cases, now there's some isolated exceptions to this, but in very few cases will you ever see a traditional public school closed because of lack of performance and lack of attainment on the part of its students. So there already is a difference in terms of expectations around accountability. I don't think that's right. I think it actually, those same accountabilities should apply to any kind of a traditional public school. And I would hope that as more states look at these realities more closely, that they will consider that in their frame of reference for how they hold all schools accountable.
So we only have a couple more minutes. Let me ask you this question. As you think about our K-12 system in our country today, what is the thing that you're the most concerned about? And what is the thing that gives you the greatest optimism of success for this system?
I would say the thing that I'm most concerned about is when I think of the faces of every student that is being failed by the current environment or the current school they're attending today, that is very personally troubling to me. And every year that we don't affect significant change is another year of that child's life. They only have a limited time in which to be in school. And so that and the pace of change has been and is of grave concern to me. On the other side, I'm optimistic because just really in the last 2 to 4 years, I feel the momentum around this changing significantly, especially when you consider a state-by-state basis. And I'm optimistic that within this current administration and with the leadership that is happening in a lot of states across the country, that we're going to be able to see and affect very significant policy change that will then benefit students.
So I know there's a lot of different viewpoints today as to how we should go about improving the system. And you are obviously a strong advocate for providing the best possible opportunities for parents to have a voice in their child's education. And I would only hope that we can have a civil discussion about how we go about doing this, because I think all of us share that goal, that we want to have the best opportunities for every child in our country. And I can evoke Ronald Reagan's famous words that we're increasingly told that the choice is between left or right. But that isn't the choice. It's the choice between up or down. And I think all of us are looking to try to improve the educational system, and thank you for your service.
Thank you so much, Lowell. Thank you all.
Thank you, Betsy.
Thanks, Lowell.
So we're going to take one moment, and we are going to bring up our 3 opinionated panelists.
I'll be where?
I guess I'll move around.
Could I ask you to hold this for just a moment
Yeah.
while we're talking to that as we swap back?
Grumpiest Bill.
So now we'll begin with part 2 of our session, and I'm pleased to welcome the 3 panelists. On my far left is Jeb Bush. I think
Not so far left.
Governor Bullock, could you change chairs with him? And Jeb was the 43rd governor of Florida. He led Florida from 1999 to 2007, during which time his state added 1.3 million new jobs and undertook bold education reforms to narrow achievement gaps. And upon leaving office, Governor Bush launched the Foundation for Excellence in Education, and that is designed to promote sound education policy and to model legislation, rulemaking expertise, and implementation strategies and outreach. And Jeb, thank you for joining us today, and most importantly, thank you for your incredible contribution to education in this country for many years. In the center, very moderate, we have Governor Steve Bullock of Montana. And Governor Bullock has been able to garner bipartisan support to balance the state budget, create a $300 million rainy day fund in his first legislative session. Governor Bullock has led increased funding for higher education and secured a tuition freeze at Montana's colleges and universities. He has also obtained historic funding for the state's public elementary, middle, and high schools. And Governor Bullock chairs the prestigious Education Commission of the states. Welcome to our panel, Steve.
Thanks.
And right here next to me is William Bennett, a former U.S. Secretary of Education serving under President Reagan. Bill also served as the nation's first drug czar under the first President Bush. He is currently on President Trump's Leadership Council, and Bill is deemed one of America's most familiar voices on cultural, political, and educational issues. I should also add that Bill has also authored over 25 books, including one of my favorites, America, The Last Best Hope. So, gentlemen, you heard my conversation with Secretary DeVos, and I'd like to begin by talking about what the role of the federal government should be in education. The federal government, as I mentioned earlier, has taken a leadership position for a half century in trying to affect various kinds of changes in our states and our districts. And with the new ESSA, we understand that the federal government's going to have far less influence. So in the current state of affairs, what should the federal role be today? Jeb, do you want to begin?
Sure. Lowell, thank you for inviting me. It's great to be amongst people that think education reform and education in general is important. It's still a minority in our country. I wish there were people protesting for the lack of student achievement in this country as they do for all sorts of things that are less relevant. So the fact that you chose to be here warms my heart. I would say the role of the federal government is to do very little, to be honest with you. I'm sitting next to a successful governor who understands education in Montana is probably the #1 priority, maybe natural resources, maybe job growth, but they're all tied together. And this whole idea that somehow Washington has all the smart people in it, that they figured it all out, defies America at its best. We're a bottom-up country. We're not a top-down country. All the innovations didn't come from some central planned place where, you know, smart people get in a room and decide all this stuff. If that was the case, then the Department of Energy's brilliant ideas of investing in alternative energy would have worked miraculously, right? But in fact, just as it is in education, the energy sector had an explosion of natural gas resources that defied the imagination of all the smart people because it was a bottom-up idea. And it worked really well. And it'll continue to work in this country. We cannot continue just to believe that Washington's the place for these things to happen. So what I would like to see is if a state wanted to take the Title I money, the monies that go to schools that have a high proportion of low-income students in them, let them design the programs for low-income kids in their schools. In Florida, we have the McKay Scholarship Program, and other states now have embraced this. Any mom or dad that does not think their individual education plan is being met, their child has a learning disability, can take dollar for dollar the state and local dollars and go to a private school. 35,000 students go to private schools because of that idea, and the public schools, based on the NIET test in Florida, do better than any state in the country in terms of learning gains for kids with learning disabilities, because there's a choice. I would rather take the IDEA money and allow states to craft that the way they would want to. Same with early childhood education. So the federal government can play a useful role of being a partner, but I think we've proven beyond any reasonable doubt that Washington's not really capable of doing a whole lot these days. Trust the governors and state legislators and community leaders from the bottom up to derive better policies. I don't know why, I'm having a hard time understanding why the natural impulse is always to say, Washington's so smart. There's no evidence of it. I mean, think about it. What's happened in the last few years that you could say, wow, that was phenomenal? They do certain things, they fund NIH, they keep us safe. There are things that they can do. Education policy isn't one of them.
Governor?
Yeah, I actually share many of Governor Bush's points. I think that at the end of the day, public education and publicly funded education is the great equalizer. Whether you're a job creator, whether you're a governor, the most important thing you can do is make sure that every single individual in your community has an opportunity to excel. Now, at the end of the day, I don't think that, well, public education or publicly funded education might be the great equalizer. I don't think it's filling that role. At the state and local level, we know much better what our community's needs are. Montana's a state of 1 million people, spread out over 147,000 square miles. We have 410 school districts. Now, on the one hand, you might think that's insane. But on the other hand, it's that local community that knows what that local community needs and how we actually enhance our schools. Federal government started its role in education. I think it's a very important areas. In Title I, making sure that those that have the greatest economic disadvantage have a little bit of help with the Great Equalizer, and also the individual with the IDEA Act, trying to say that some students that have some special needs will help out along. Somewhere along the line, though, I think they forgot about the systemic inequities that they first got involved in public education to address. And it's been a flavor of the day. Federal government says, well, what we need is more testing. Well, now the federal government says, well, what we need is more STEM. Federal government then says, well, no, we need to show more failing schools. And now the flavor of the day may well end up school choice. Notwithstanding the fact that, as we saw, 75% of our kids are in a public system, or a public school, and we do see innovation in some areas there. So from my perspective, as we look going forward, recognizing that the federal government won't have all the solutions. It's actually those at the state level that does. And we don't need those top-down approaches. Where we can be incentivized, where we can be assisted, that's one thing. But what we've seen in the history of the federal government getting engaged in the public system or in the educational system at the state and local level, it hasn't fundamentally changed outcomes.
Well, I would agree with that. Let's take a look at slide 61 for a moment. So we can see here that the federal government has invested more than $275 billion in Title I since 1980. And we can see that
That's ugly.
pretty much student achievement has been flatlined for that time period and so on. So the question is really, do we blame the federal government for the results that have taken place, or have we not seen sufficient number of state leaders and local leaders moving forward here to try to do what's necessary to improve education? That's a question. Bill, do you have a comment on that?
Yeah, sure. You blame them both. As Governor Bush said, give them the Title I money. We'll know what to do with it. Massachusetts knew.
I don't know if they can hear you.
You hear me? It's those protesters again. Milken University. All right. Anyway, blame them both. Federal government thought it could do one size fits all. You forgot under directives, Governor, create bathrooms of a student's gender choice. That's a critical educational imperative to get scores up. And more coming, or more were to come. They're not-
Some civil rights protections along the way too, Secretary.
I don't know about that, but we can argue. Doesn't have much to do with these scores, that's for damn sure. It doesn't have much to do with jobs. But no, I'd agree with the governors. In the words of the exorcist and the federal government, get the hell out, for God's sakes, get out. When I was Secretary of Education, what kind of proved this is we did a survey of all our recipients. And I said, what's the best program we run? And it came in, and the results were overwhelming. Block grants. What do you know? We take the money, we take 10% out, send it back to you. That's the best damn program you got. How about we never take the money in the first place and let you do it? Look, left to themselves, some governors, you know, like these guys, I don't know this governor's record. I know this governor's record, I know what he did. I know what the state of Massachusetts did. You know, you prove the possible by the actual. We know where we are internationally. We heard that, 20th, 25th. Massachusetts, if we're a country, would be 10th in the world because they did it. They took their federal money, and they were smart about it. But they had to fight Washington a long way along the way to do that. By the way, I take issue with something you said earlier, if I may. I don't think you have a teacher shortage. I think you have artificial limits on people who can get into teaching. Idiotic certification requirements, and the fact that the NEA and the AFT call these 2 or 3 year or 4 year teachers educational tourists. 18% of the graduating class from my college, Williams College, 20% of the graduating class from Harvard applied to Teach for America. Most of them were rejected. Well, because they're not going to be long-term teachers. What's wrong with the jolt of energy and intelligence of 22, 23, 24, 25-year-olds for 3 years, even if it's only 3 years, into our schools, particularly into the kind of schools they'd go to? And I'll bet some of them would stay, but the constraints are such in the teaching profession that I think discourage a lot of people who otherwise would want to go in.
Lowell, can I make one quick point?
ahead.
Maybe we'll get off the federal government's role in education after this, but I think people confuse the federal government with a national priority. It's not necessarily true that you have to have a federal program, robust federal, regulation and programs from the top down through a government to not believe, as I do passionately, that this is the highest, most important issue that this country faces, which is a third of our kids are college and or career ready. It's just that the solution doesn't have to come through the federal government. It's a national priority, and it should be a bipartisan, nonpartisan calling for all of us to recognize that the next generation is going to meet challenges we couldn't even imagine today. Given the rest of the world and artificial intelligence and robotics, all this stuff is happening whether we want it or not. And if you assume that's the case, it's a tidal wave that's going to hit the next generation, and many of us, including people in this room. And the idea that somehow that's a federal government programs, that there's a solution to that, I think is wrong. But certainly it should be a high national priority, and it isn't right now.
Jeb, when you were governor, you introduced a number of innovative programs and so on to boost student achievement. But one of the key questions is the issue of sustainability. And as you look today, out of all the innovation that you did, and from the time you left governor, what has remained?
Well, that's a great question because success is never final and reforms never complete. You have to constantly be pushing. In a democracy, I mean, I at least am happy we have term limits in the case of the governor. So other new governors come in, best of intentions, different priorities, and many of the reforms begin to lag. Although in Florida, I'd say the longest lasting gains have been we've narrowed the gaps amongst low income versus the rest of the student population in a way that's as good as maybe all but 2 or 3 states. That's the place where our accountability system and school choice and a focus on early childhood literacy, that kind of concoction created some massive gains that have been sustained. Where we don't, we talked about this at lunch, where I'd say Florida needs to steal ideas from other states is how do you create the high school of as Terry is talking about. I think our high schools are too industrialized, not as dynamic as they need to be, and that's a place where both traditional schools and charter schools can play a useful role in modernizing the system. There's a lot of work that needs to be done there.
Right. So, Governor, you have made a point to try to offer greater opportunities to the high school students in your state. You have a lot of rural districts, I assume. And so you have a big push for high-speed internet connection and offering course selection for these schools where they can't obtain it in an individual school. And then you're also working on the other end of early childhood education. Maybe you could just comment on those two ends of that challenge in the K-12.
You bet. And I think all of us really want to make sure that wherever a child is located, that they have the best educational opportunities and opportunities for attainment possible. And a couple different areas that we've been working on. So I've been governor, just got reelected. First 4 years, fewer state employees than when I first came in. 40% of all increases in expenditures have actually gone to our public education system. 45 states, as Governor Bush had suggested, understand that early investments in our children have a long-term overall success. We know that if a child shows up not kindergarten ready, half as likely to be reading grade level by 3rd grade. If you're not reading a grade level by 3rd grade, 4 times more likely to drop out of high school. You go to my state prison, 85% of the people in that didn't graduate from high school. Certainly co-occurring issues as well. So Montana finally made our first investment, just my last legislative session ended Friday, in early childhood education. And there's great models, Democratic and Republican legislators and governors saying these are investments we can't afford not to make. Now the other thing is if you live in Billings, Montana, our largest city, which has about 100,000 people, or Belt, Montana, which is a town of probably 300, that child ought to be able to get Mandarin Chinese instruction if that's what he or she wants to do. So from a state-funded perspective, we started the Digital Academy. The Digital Academy is actually run out of one of our universities. It has class ranges that about 7,000 of the students that are in those are taking them for either college or their local school. It's not available. Then about 3,000 of the kids are credit recovery, trying to advance in other ways. But to recognize that just like we can't have one-size-fits-all education, but we need to be able to create more opportunities in places that otherwise might not be able to have that. And I think technology can be one of the fundamental things that helps us bridge that gap as we go forward.
Let's turn for a moment to college readiness and we know a recent report came out, said that 1 out of 4 students entering college have to enroll in remedial courses during their first year. And let's take a look at chart 39 for a moment.
I love all these charts.
And this shows that remedial education is not really just geared to those who are low income, that the students who are taking remedial courses in college actually are across the entire spectrum. And then it's also estimated that if a first-year remedial student seeking a bachelor's degree, if they're taking remedial courses, they're 74% more likely to drop out. Let's take a look at chart 41 for a moment. And this also tells us that in our high schools today, this is the curriculum sort of measures. We have 47% of the students that are in our high schools have no cohesive curriculum. And what's shocking is really only 8% are taking a curriculum that's college or career ready. So let me ask you an unusual question. Does higher education have a responsibility to try to improve our K-12 system? And if it does, what should higher education be doing? Because they are bearing the brunt to a significant degree of a lack of success with students prepared for college.
Not bearing the brunt, they're getting more tuitions, they're getting more bodies, which is what they want.
And keeping them longer.
And some of them they're keeping longer. Remember, of all the students who apply for four-year colleges, 48% finish. So there may be a lot of students going to college who shouldn't or shouldn't be going to that college. But the situation in California is unbelievable. The number of people not just taking remedial courses, but waiting to take remedial courses on waiting lists. Yeah, no, look, foreign languages were dropped in the high schools because the colleges stopped requiring them. If you raised academic standards in colleges, you would have fewer students for a while. And in my experience in higher education, the thing that matters most is money. That's what seems to drive the program. I know other things are supposed to drive it, but empirically, I would say that's the issue. Other things, though, do matter. If I could just say two things. Plug a book, not mine, Amanda Ripley's book, The Smartest Kids in the World and How They Got That Way. You know the book. And she did an interesting experiment, sent 3 American kids to 3 different countries that do a good job, and said, what's going on? And they said, they worked us to death. They worked us really, really hard. Now, we may not want to do that because it cuts into iPhone time and, other things. Puberty,
That may be a good
well, that's a big one. When I was named secretary, they said, if you wave a magic wand to get rid of one problem that interferes with education, what would it be? I said, puberty. And they said, sounds like a conservative, right? He's opposed to all that. But they worked hard. They worked really hard. The other thing is, very few debates get into this, but the form of instruction, whether you have the college ready or the other thing, the debate about formalism versus content in education. Mm-hmm. Education is not about learning how to learn. This has become, a favorite phrase. It's about learning something. It's about content. And this whole formalistic notion, I think, has really produced very, very bad results as opposed to kids who read. If you look at kids who read, even poor kids, poor instruction in the school, but they read constantly and read in areas of study that they're interested in, they turn out well. There's nothing quite like knowledge. I'm a Hirsch guy. I'm an E.D. Hirsch guy. I admit it. But there's nothing like knowing something. Knowing how to learn is one thing. Knowing something is something else.
Jeb, what efforts did you do in higher ed to try to help propel a K-12 system?
Most of our efforts in higher ed, the first thing we did is we created a governance structure where we had boards of trustees for the universities, thinking if I put high-quality people into the universities, they would create strategic plans and they would accept accountability and in return for the state money. It was a total failure. These very talented men and women ended up being cheerleaders for their alma maters by and large and protected the academy from any kind of real-world reforms. I don't know if it's necessary. I'm not sure higher ed is the problem, though, if a third of your kids are college and or career ready. I mean, you can say we clearly have lowered, dumbed down standards. There's a shock in May coming this month when little Johnny comes home with a high school diploma and says, I'm a high school graduate, and mom looks at this with great pride and then says, well, what about this test that says you can't get to Miami-Dade College because you have to retake high school math and high school reading. So higher standards is one of the things that every state should look at. We created the Florida Virtual School, which was the first virtual school in the country. We ended up, at the peak, it had 600,000 credits, courses administered per year. And it equalized the chance for students to be able to take AP classes, for example. We now have in our grading system rewards for teachers and for schools for passing the AP test, and we've seen triple-digit increases particularly among low-income kids and rural kids that didn't have access to college-ready kind of courses. After I left, the legislature included a nationally recognized certifications inside that same accountability system. And Florida went from like 2%, Governor, of the students taking a nationally recognized certification, which, as you said at the lunch, ranges now from not just, it ranges for everything, to 39% of all high school students are taking and passing nationally recognized courses, which gives them the chance to get a college credit, a high school credit, obviously, and something that they could actually use to get a job. That kind of merging is what I know many governors are looking at because we're working with them. I think that's the path to raising expectations and then giving many more alternatives than what students have right now using the internet and other means.
Yeah, we've doubled the number of high school students taking college classes while in high school, dual enrollment. This isn't just for the high achiever to save money, even though I can say I've saved Montana parents and families $3 million in tuition by taking those classes there. But what it's really for is that child that was never told anywhere that he or she was college material. If the first college courses they take are in the relatively safety and comfort of a high school classroom, they're more likely to retain. And what we've done is we followed those students as they've gone to college. And actually, it's sort of the medium students, the B and C students, that are actually having higher gaps in proficiency and going quicker to degree than even those at the higher level. So the impact is greater there. I think also that our higher education system, we're now making every high school student take the ACT. Even if you're not college bound, that's going to be what we're going to judge. And then those kids that it doesn't look like they're going to be ready, it's through Philanthropy that we start a program called Ed Ready, and run through that digital academy then as well. And we do online proficiency in math, and we work with those students there. I mean, we need to start looking at education as not just statistics, but individual successes. And if there are ways that higher education can address and take down some of those barriers or help build up kids in high school to make sure that they're closer to being college ready. And then we also have, because of dual enrollment and because of the work-based learning that Governor Bush was talking about, I mean, I have high school students that are graduating with high school with a 2-year associate's degree in welding. Or they're graduating with professional certifications in things that they're interested in and excited about, and they can immediately go into the workforce, not only earning a higher wage, but also having those skills that our employers need in our state.
So we're going to be running out of time pretty soon, and I asked this question to the secretary when I ended, but what is the thing that concerns you the most going forward with our K-12 education system, and what are you most optimistic about with our students today in our schools? Bill, do you want to start?
Yes, sure. So many things. What I'm optimistic about is the debate is still going on. There are people who are still at it like you. You've been at it a long time. And interesting things. There are governors like Bush, and I'm sure the governor to my left, whom I don't know, doing things.
Don't believe it then, not a
Or
chance.
Not left. I meant up. What? It's up and down, not left and right?
That's
Okay. The up governor.
I did introduce you to the governor a while back.
Yeah, we got to know each other a little bit. It's unless we change practice, unless we change the way we hire teachers, I very much agree with the TAP efforts, unless we change the way we're teaching. I mean, these charts, 33, 34, I mean, you have a run of charts here, which just are flat line. Just keep spending more money, and it's flat line. There's something wrong here. The one, I don't want to end on a downer, but this is serious for the future of our country. The book, which concludes the following: at the beginning of high school, the majority of second-generation Americans identified themselves as American in some form, either simply or some hyphenated form, as, say, Filipino-American or Cuban-American. But after several years of American high school, barely 1/3 still identified themselves as American, with most adopting either a foreign nationality, The educational system continues to do an abysmal job of making students understand that they are Americans. In fact, it takes them in the opposite direction, thus the influence of multiculturalism as a pedagogical principle. That's really sad. People remain alien to themselves, to the culture in which they are going to grow up and live. That is a real tragedy.
Governor, could you answer that question both from what gives you the greatest concern and what are you most optimistic about?
Let's start where I'm probably most excited and optimistic. I mean, I'm a product of public schools. Our 3 kids go to the same schools that my wife and I went to. And I spent a lot of time in our schools. Some of them that would be viewed as failing, and some of them where the attainment is just amazing. I see incredibly dedicated individuals trying to do much, much better. And I do see innovation. It was interesting preparing. I found William Crystal, who was your chief of staff back when you're Secretary of Education, said, "We think there's a lot of evidence that traditional methods are working." Now, this was in the late 80s. Traditional methods aren't always working, and that's why collectively, public, private, philanthropic sectors have to say, how do we innovate? How do we do better? And I am seeing both that innovation and I'm seeing attainment in that respect, but I know that we have a long way to go if we truly are going to be the great equalizer, which education is. What I guess concerns me a little bit as we go, especially as we're talking about both the role of local and state versus federal, that we lose sight of why the federal government supposedly got involved in education in the first place. And I think that we do share that I don't want the federal government dictating how our students, our teachers, our families, or our local school boards are going to drive educational innovation. That concerns me significantly. I think also as we look going forward, making sure that we are addressing some of the systemic inequities and needs, and also addressing one thing that Secretary Bennett said, is that as we go forward, we also have to make sure that we're getting qualified educators, teachers in there, providing them the support that they need, because with this new generation coming in, I mean, we are going to have, even now, an extant teacher shortage that we need to address.
Governor?
Thank you, Lowell. I love to read, and for the last couple of weeks I've been reading with a focus on disruption. And about 3 weeks ago I read about UPS. Imagine the data that they can accumulate. Every truck, they know exactly where it is any given time. And they did an analysis and they determined that it was smarter to never take a left turn, unless you're in the UK, in which case they probably changed it. And so they executed on this knowing that it would work, and the net result was, in an annualized basis, a lot less carbon. If that's what rocks your world, it was a smart move. 1,000 trucks, though, were taken off the roads, and productivity was enhanced greatly. But that means 1,000 fewer truck drivers. And if you look at the world we're in today, millions of jobs are being eradicated in front of our nose. Look at the stories about the retail industry now finally being hit hard by the internet. For every job that is lost in retail, there's 10 jobs lost in retail. There'll be 1 or 2 that will replace it in the disruptive shared economy that we're moving towards. You take that challenge, and then you look at the education outcomes that are flatlined for the last generation of time, and it's not just education, it's not the sole solution to this. We've totally disrupted family life. Our communities some of them are fantastic, like the ones around here, but you don't go too far east of here, and you're in places that are kind of scary. And the net result is we're going to see social strains in this country that are devastating, and to me, education is the solution, the path forward. So that's what scares me. What excites me is America in its history has never accepted a status quo that drives us off a cliff. I mean, think about it. In what time have we said, let's just keep doing the same thing over and over again because it's not working? That is not America. And so I am totally optimistic that there'll be a spark. It probably won't happen through government. It'll happen through people realizing how important this is. And there'll be a change in culture, and education will be highly valued again. And when that happens, our country will lead the world.
I think our time is up, and I want to thank Governor Bush, Governor Bullock, and Bill Bennett. Thank you very much for your comments.